Good afternoon, fellow convergees. Welcome to the Fighting Censorship in Fandom Spaces. Thank you for attending. So usually, the way I like to run the panels is maybe for the first half to have the panelists discuss things, and the second half open up to audience questions or thoughts. Just to start with, and as Lauren wanted to make sure that wanted me to be sure to point out that maybe discussing some sensitive topics, people may feel strongly. I just ask that maybe if something seems wrong or offensive, to give us the benefit of the doubt, and maybe you can bring it up as a point or talk to us later if you feel there's something that any of us has been getting completely wrong. So just to start with, we can have the panelists introduce themselves, and please let us know about your websites, podcasts, anything else that you would start here.
Sure. My name is Kerry. I don't have any socials in particular to share, but if anyone wants to connect later, I'm happy to chat. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm coming at this from a long time fan of many different spaces. I spent a lot of time in various fandoms and noticed kind of an increase in self-censorship by a lot of people. And then I also work in some activism spaces, so also coming at it from sort of a socio-political perspective and how I see those kind of mirroring things that we see in fandom.
Thanks. All right, hello everyone. Thank you for attending this Sunday. Woo, we made it, right? It's very fun for my first time. So I am Jules Porter. I'm a local attorney. I practice a lot of computer technology law, intellectual property law, consumer protection, and also constitutional law. I'm also a law professor at the University of St. Thomas, where I teach business law, intellectual property law, and a little bit of entrepreneurship. I am also a video game developer and an AI developer. So I kind of come from a heavy constitutional background of what our rights are, and also, right, the importance of protecting those rights, especially our First Amendment rights to free speech, to information, and other things of that nature. So I really look forward to diving in with all of you.
I'm Lauren Crabtree, she, her. I am Lauren the Corgi on Blue Sky, although just as a heads up, if you do look that up, there may be some not safe for work material on there, so just a heads up about that. I'm coming at this from two standpoints. One, I am a longtime fanfic writer who specializes in all things labeled dead dove do not eat. So I have encountered the sort of pro-censorship rise in certain fandom circles that have started to believe that what you write about in fiction equates to what you condone in real life, which is certainly not true, but is a sentiment that is increasingly taking hold of the fandom. I'm also coming at this as a professional game master that regularly attends Gen Con and also recently started attending Big Bad Con, and both of those conventions had boycotts against them last year when the cons started trying to censor panelists' speech about certain activism-related topics. So I want to get into that on this panel as well, and specifically as someone who was contractually obligated to attend Gen Con last year while the Gen Con boycott was going on.
And I'm Assad Khaishgi. I feel I might be the least qualified person on this panel. Just a general interest in these sort of topics, especially since, as has been pointed out in the description, this is kind of on the rise in pretty much every sphere of life that we have. And I think just to start with first, Jules wanted to go over read out the First Amendment, just since that's pretty relevant to this topic and something that gets invoked often and not always accurately.
Exactly. So it's good to start with a good baseline of what the First Amendment actually says, and it's very, very short. So it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that actually has quite a few rights in there. It has your right to freedom of religion. It has your freedom of speech. It has your right to assemble and to associate with whoever you would like to associate. without being kept on the government registry. It has a right to petition the government to protest for redress of grievances. Did I miss one? There you go. Those are your rights that are given to you by the First Amendment.
Okay. So it's been, I think Kerry already mentioned about self-censorships, but so since you just read out the First Amendment, how do you feel about self-censorship versus external forces of censorship?
Yeah, so the thing with self-censorship, we kind of call that in constitutional law a chilling of your free speech. So a chilling of speech basically occurs when you feel as though you will be threatened or you are somehow being intimidated into not using your speech. And so when we talk about a democracy versus an authoritarian government, usually when we move towards an authoritarian government, right, the dictator will make it so that good people or people who could hold that person accountable are afraid to speak up and afraid to use their speech, right? They want to make it where everyone could be an informant to the government, and they want the government to be seen as though it is in all parts of your life. And so that is something to look out for. So that's an example of good people choosing to silence themselves because they fear some type of retaliation or they're being intimidated in some way. The external censorship is basically when you have your ESRB ratings, or if they refuse to put something on the shelves because maybe it has a mature rating or something of that nature. So some of that is censorship, but some of that too is categorization, which is more okay. It's okay to kind of warn and alert people of what type of topics might be covered in a certain work, but not necessarily to censor it by saying, and because of that, we're not going to allow people to see this.
And I think that during this discussion, if people want to mention examples that are not necessarily related to fandom or geekdom, I think we should be okay with that. Kerry, do you have any thoughts about the self versus other sorts of censorship?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we see in online spaces is different. People have different understandings of what is okay and what's not, and they will not only censor themselves and self-censorship, just trying to avoid certain topics or avoid seeing those topics, but they also then want to apply that to other people, which is, I think, one of the reasons we get different divides within fandoms, and sometimes they get extremely heated, very strong, emotional opinions about differences, and part of that is based on the culture and their ideas of what should be shared and what should be allowed in those types of spaces, and their idea of kind of very abstractly thinking, well, this is what I feel should be there, and wanting to enforce that on other people, which ends up in this sort of struggle between groups and trying to say, well, this is right, this is wrong. And one of the things that I've seen pretty regularly happen is there's a term called pro-ship, anti-ship, that has gone through different phases of popularity in online spaces and fandom. And one of the things that I see, I don't like these terms personally, but one of the reasons that I mention it is that they tend to set up the opposing argument very strongly with a straw man argument, and then they're fighting against an opponent that doesn't really exist. But I think in part that is due to this idea of wanting to be the ones who are doing things correctly, and I think it is really all tied in with this idea of censorship and trying to kind of police how people interact within fandom and who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong, and wanting to involve themselves in that, other people's discussion of how things exist in the shared fandom spaces.
One thing that I wanted to sort of piggyback on that you had just said is we'd mentioned the idea of self-censorship due to fear of legal repercussions or things of that nature. But one thing I've also seen a lot in fandom spaces, largely due to these sort of less external, more internal discussions, particularly in that pro-ship, anti-ship discourse, is self-censorship due to fear of social ostracization. Even if you know that legally you aren't doing anything wrong, which, granted, doesn't always hold a lot of weight in the grand scheme of things, because there are plenty of corrupt things that are completely legal and plenty of virtuous things that can have legal consequences if you do them the wrong way. But if the popular attitude to have is that XYZ should be censored, if you speak out against that, then there is a chance that people who you thought were your friends could turn on you. And I see a lot of people in fandom spaces who enjoy heavier themes and are afraid to talk about them because they know that the attitudes have kind of turned against those themes in, say, the last 10, 15 years.
So maybe we can keep with you, Lauren. Do you think there's any sort of, would you say there's differences between censorship, cancel culture, gatekeeping? Any thoughts on how you differentiate them, or is there any, I mean, I guess censorship might be if you say it's more from the sides of government or authority, but are there any differences you would say between those three things?
Well, I would say the terms cancel culture and gatekeeping can apply to more than just censorship. There are plenty of other things that someone might make a call-out post over besides thinking that somebody needs to be censored for XYZ reason. Gatekeeping, I think, is also a term that can apply to more than just censorship, because there are one thing that I've particularly seen in fandom spaces in terms of gatekeeping that can overlap with censorship actually is the idea of who is allowed to write about certain themes. I've seen people saying that if you haven't lived through a given hardship, you aren't allowed to write about it in fiction. And while I do think that there is a degree of truth to that, I want to read fiction that is well researched, is informed by people's real life experiences, and portrays the experience of going through hardship accurately. I also know that sometimes creators aren't open about personal things that they've gone through because opening up about those experiences could put them in danger, or because they just don't want to get that personal with their fan base. And I think there is a degree of parasociality that can come into effect particularly when creators of fan works try to hold each other to a certain standard of openness, when really a lot of people creating fan works did not go into it with the intent of having a fan base holding them to that kind of standard. I think there can be overlap between the three terms, but I don't think that they're all one and the same.
So for me, some of the differences that I see between censorship, cancel culture, and gatekeeping is that censorship is basically where this thing can be seen or where this thing can be read. So that's Facebook saying you can't share this here, right? But maybe you could share it over on some other platform, or one library saying we'll have your book here, and somebody else saying no, or one country saying you can have your speech and you can talk here, another country saying that you can't talk about that over here, and we're gonna block all of your sites. So censorship, I think, is more along the lines of where this can be seen or experienced. For me, cancel culture is the reaction to what you said, right? So you have your First Amendment speech to say whatever it is you want to say, and then people have their First Amendment right to react however it is they want to react, as long as nobody is being violent, right? So once you are violent or you incite violence, then that goes beyond your First Amendment rights to, now that's a crime, right? And then now you might be civilly liable as well, right? So that's the reaction to your speech. And then gatekeeping, that's kind of like whether it's seen, right? So that's whether they're gonna support and help push and market like what you have going on, or whether they're gonna actively try to stop whatever you're doing from being seen by the people that you want to see it, the masses. So those are the differences. I think censorship is where it can be seen, cancel culture is the reaction to the speech, and then gatekeeping is just whether, right? Whether you're going to get support, whether they're going to help promote or try to regress what you're trying to say or what you're trying to do.
I think that I do agree with a lot of these points as well that both of you have made. I think that in some ways there are sort of two sides to the same coin of kind of just general social ideas about intellectual purity in various contexts. I think we see in the modern sort of evangelical conservatism movement something that is very similar to what we see in the more progressive side of that as well. So we have like purity culture on the right. These are overlapping concepts. I'm just very generalized here. We have a sort of purity culture. The idea, it is very tied to religion, sin in many places, in many contexts, at least here in America. And in the more progressive spaces, which tend to be more of the fandom spaces, again, I'm generalizing, so take it with a grain of salt, but we have the idea of intellectual purity, and when I think there's a lot of black and white thinking that goes on in places that should allow for a lot of gray areas, and people want to divide these things up, to divide groups up and say, you're not a good enough fan if you don't do this, or you don't understand these characters the right way. And I think that there is a lot of overlap in that. Some of the things that happen in sort of everyday life bleeds that into fandom as well, and that's part of the reason that we're seeing those types of things. And so I think that gatekeeping and like cancel culture, I think these are all kind of symptoms of a larger movement that we've been seeing that are multi-sided, that it's the polarization at a general level, at a general cultural level, where people are trying to divide things up into clean boxes, and the reality is that it's rarely so simple. It's rarely so clean as that.
I was going to move on since you and Jaymie had both brought up purity culture, so I was going to move on to that next. So, did you have more to say on that topic? Or no? Do you have anything?
I did have a thing that I wanted to follow up on. You had said, you had sort of compared that parallel of religion to the purity culture and fandom. And one thing that I wanted to touch on that is I think that one is sort of indirectly caused by the other, in that a lot of people in fandom have, especially younger people in fandom, have unlearned religion, but have not unlearned a lot of the impulses and rituals that come from religion, especially that idea of wanting to believe that if someone doesn't follow the same moral tenets than you do, then they're inherently a bad person. And people don't necessarily, and more specifically, a lot of the attitudes towards No, actually, I won't. I won't elaborate on that right now. But I think that that there is a lot of introspection that needs to be done in certain fandom spaces on where is this impulse to censor coming from? Is this something that I was taught in a different context prior that I haven't really unpacked yet, even if I have unpacked the source of it?
And I think a lot of our popular Western story arcs or archetypes also mirror that sort of polarization as well. Like, we get a lot of these good versus evil, overarching plotlines and storylines where you have the good characters and the bad characters, and perhaps not enough time spent in the gray zone in the middle, whereas it's easy to sort of categorize these things that way.
So I would kind of disagree that religion is so binary. I would kind of speak up a little bit for that. In that, there's many different religions out there, right? And not all religions are saying that if you don't believe exactly what we believe, that you're the other and that you're going to hell or something like that. There's many religions that are open and tolerant and believe in discussing ideas openly. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I probably should have in my statement. Conservative Christianity is something that a lot of people have unlearned the idea of, but haven't necessarily unlearned all of the impulses that come with it.
Well, hey, my version of Christianity is transformative love, right? Because that's the example of Christ. It's not condemning people, but just loving them despite where they are, right? And showing them that they can be loved and are worthy of love. But going just a little bit back, because I think we touched on something, and I just wanted to mention one place where I really hate when I see censorship are college campuses. We sometimes see things where we get really interesting, maybe controversial speakers that come in that may have some alternative, really crazy seeming wild viewpoint. And so they want to come to a campus, the campus students will protest, and then they will disinvite the speaker. I've always been against that because I believe that college campuses are the places where we need to have those hard conversations and where we need to start teaching more civil discourse and how to listen to people that you disagree with and how to respectfully push back on their ideas and have a good, robust discussion and to kind of highlight the fallacies with them right there on the spot, rather than just say, we don't even want to talk about whatever it is that you want to bring over here. I think you have to discuss it, right? Because especially if it's somebody that has some following, because you need to show the followers that there is a counterpoint that is extremely valid and worthy of being heard. And we will also hear what you have to say, and we'll come at this, from a thoughtful, intellectual place. And I think that we really need college campuses to be strong and to kind of model that. And let's see. Oh, the other thing that I just want to make sure I said is that it's, of course, not illegal to disagree, right? I think that we need to remember that. You can disagree, right? When it becomes illegal is when you become violent or you put your hands on somebody. So as long as you can control that, which, again, we have to keep teaching civil discourse, because it seems like over the pandemic that there were definitely a group of students who were not exposed to that part of their development as much as other generations. And so some parts of learning how to disagree civilly and not feel as though that's so attached to your core identity because somebody has a disagreement with you is a very important thing that we can't allow to be lost in our nation.
I think you see that in such minor things in terms of fandom. Like, I think what I would see, at least online, a lot of times, any disagreement sometimes with any Star Trek show, like a Doctor Who, just to take a couple of examples, any sort of criticism would immediately be met with that the only reason this person is disagreeing is because they're racist or sexist or some other issue like that. And admittedly, a lot of those people, when they would keep on talking, would actually turn out to be racist or sexist, but that doesn't mean that every criticism of any particular show immediately starts from that angle. So do you have any thoughts, and let's start with you, Jules, about how can we keep this from happening? Is there anything we can do to keep this from happening, and I don't want to say our side because everything doesn't come down to us and them, but how to keep things more open?
Well, we have to make sure we're protecting freedom of speech for all. And so there was a really interesting case a few decades back where some KKK members were actually, they were charged with something by the city to say that they can no longer gather and congregate and basically have their KKK meeting. They actually hired lawyers from the NAACP to represent them in court because, right, they did have a mutual shared interest there. Because once you stop one group of people just from meeting, right, you can't, regardless of whatever the content is, as long as they're not doing anything criminal like plotting to overthrow the government or, something like that, that is definitely illegal where there's laws. But people meeting, even if they're meeting to talk about hateful things, right, if the government starts regulating that and stepping in there, and that's only a slippery slope to regulating more and more things, right? And that goes into regulating people who might gather for an NAACP meeting, right, or a meeting for the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense or something of that nature. So we just have to be vigilant about making sure we are protecting the rights, because there is something called equal protection of the law, and that is to make sure that the government is treating similarly situated people the same. And if the government treats similarly situated people differently, then they have just violated a person's equal protection rights. So those things are just very, very important to me.
Lauren or Kerry?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that I think is really helpful for those kinds of spaces, at least in online fandom, but actually in real life spaces as well, is encouraging people to communicate about these things in a neutral way. So if there is a disagreement or concern, rather than saying, so with a caveat that this can be emotional work for the people having the conversation. If there's a way to say, okay, this is not intended to be an attack on you, but there is this thing that you said that I find concerning for various reasons, so that people are allowed to be wrong and allowed to learn from that and grow from that without it being something that's going to impact their fandom life for the rest of eternity, right? This person was racist this one time, and they said this thing without thinking it through or whatever, or they didn't know, or there's a term that they used that had loaded connotations or something. The fear regularly that I've seen is that if I do something wrong once, it's going to haunt me forever, so I won't engage with that content at all. And that way, you are doing something to preserve peace, but you are also not learning and growing, and so you're not understanding those topics that really, they're going to be difficult to understand if you don't dive in a little bit. And so you see that a lot in fandoms that have a lot of diverse representation in various ways. If someone does not have that experience, well, I don't want to write this character because they're not like me, and I don't want to get it wrong and then be vilified by the community that I'm trying to represent through my story or explore through the story. Which, again, it's not coming from an ill intent, a place of ill intent, but it can have both harmful and beneficial consequences because of that. So, there's a fine line. There's a lot of gray area, and letting people live into that gray area and potentially learn and grow from it is incredibly valuable in creating a space where you can have those kinds of conversations and continue to learn and grow.
One thing that I wanted to say about that in terms of determining whether someone's disagreement is coming from a place of bigotry or a genuine lack of understanding is, if possible, try and pay attention to whether there is a pattern of behavior with the person that you are disagreeing with, or whether they are relatively new to the topic that is being discussed, or just don't otherwise have the experience to come at it from the same standpoint as you. Because I see this in particular in a lot of online spaces. There will be people that tend to assume that just because you are involved with one aspect of a kind of space, then you must know everything that's going on within it. And not everyone is online to the same degree, and that's not going to be the case for every person. One thing that I feel like this also applies to criticism a lot. I see when I see writers or game designers or what have you get harsh criticism, they sometimes are inclined to jumping to assume that criticism is coming from a place of bigotry or not wanting a marginalized creator to succeed if they don't agree with that criticism. And in some cases that's true, and in some cases it's not. And I think that paying attention to who else that person is critiquing can be a great way to suss that out. For instance, there is a Yeah, I think I will talk about this here. When I was, so I mentioned earlier that I'd been to a few conventions that last year had boycotts against them, and one of those was Big Bad Con. And Big Bad Con specifically had a boycott organized against it last year because it was revealed that certain panels had language related to speaking out against the genocide going on in Palestine that was being censored. And people understandably organized a boycott against Big Bad Con, and eventually it definitely seemed like the con organizers were kind of dragging their feet on trying to rectify what they had done. And eventually they did come around and say, we've hired a consultant, you can rephrase the discussions in your panels in this way, and we'll let you still host them. And the boycott was lifted, but eventually it Basically, it seemed like all was well at first with the convention, but there were still some when the time came around for the convention to actually be hosted. There were some pro-Israel protesters that were standing in the lobby of the convention that were just allowed to be there and to speak up in favor of the genocide that was going on without repercussions, and it was revealed later that the consultant that had been hired was also someone who stood with those protesters, and I think that the lack of looking into the history of the consultant that was hired, if the con organizers had been more thorough into who they hired to do that consultation, they could have mitigated the post-convention consequences that came from that, because the boycott has since been reinstated, and there is now not going to be a big bad con next year as a result of that. And I think that long story short, if you are going into a discussion where you disagree with someone, if possible, do your research on the history of who you're having that discussion with. Understand whether they are educated on the topic or not, what their stance is, and it can be helpful to know going in, am I having a discussion with someone who genuinely holds bigoted beliefs, or am I holding a discussion with someone who is not educated on the topic?
Before we open up to the audience, do either of you have anything further to comment on that?
One very interesting space where I'm seeing censorship that I think is very troubling is actually in AI development. So I think we all probably know or have seen there's so many documentaries and research on the fact that we basically gave AI a bunch of very biased data, right? And so right now, AI is basically a preteen. We're teaching it what to do with that biased data that it has, how to be, not so immoral, how to not be bigoted, how to not be racist, right? And so part of that is asking the AI, hey, here's a question, seeing how the AI responds, telling it what was good, what was wrong, and then what a model response was. So that's called basically supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement learning from human feedback. And so what's going on right now, though, is that as we're asking it questions and we're teaching it what to do with the data that we know is biased, and basically how to process that in a way that doesn't cause harm, right? The testers are being told, but you don't want to have any topics that are not safe for work, right? And what I've seen on the back end of that, how people are interpreting not safe for work, includes anything that has to do with Black history. Because Black history, a lot of it, especially in America, has to do with a lot of pain, a lot of difficulties. We're talking about racism, we're talking about harms that it caused. We're talking about in some point some of the injuries, we're talking about lynchings, right? And people feel as though I don't feel comfortable doing this, and so they allow them to then pass on that particular task and move to the next one. Well, if we're not actually helping it process and learn this Black history, right, and we're moving more and more to a world that is using AI in education and in other fields, when all of a sudden this Black history is being lost, right? And if we're already trying to take it out of schools, and if we're already trying to censor certain books that are in schools and saying, look, these particular books are harmful, I really worry about what that does for our understanding of just underrepresented cultures in America, right? And cultures that we've harmed and have some pain in their history, right? That we now are saying is not safe for work for us to teach AI how to better understand that. And to show you one example, so when I was training the AI, I told it, okay, I'm a law clerk and I'm working for an awesome judge. The judge is about to retire and we need to make an awesome retirement party for her. She really loves history, so let's have some dishes, some food dishes named after female Supreme Court justices. Please give me a list. Okay, so it starts with like Sonia Sotomayor's pasta, Alita Kagan's Greek salad, right? So it's just very basic general things. But then it says Harriet Tubman's fried chicken. And I say, okay, AI, let's talk about what went wrong here, right? So it's like, first of all, Harriet Tubman was an amazing American hero, but she was not a Supreme Court justice. Second of all, you associated, right? It's almost like you pulled her out of nowhere in order to bring up fried chicken because you felt like you needed a black person to associate with fried chicken. So I then had to teach AI, all cultures of people love fried chicken, okay? And have some variation of fried chicken as part of like their food. As long as there is a chicken on their land, okay, they have fried it. So, just unpacking that. But imagine if I wasn't there, right? Imagine if that particular response came to somebody in Japan who was working on this, right? Or some, I don't know, white guy from Canada. Right? And so we need people that have a diverse background working in AI, helping to develop it, helping it to learn this morality, and to be a little bit more inclusive and not to run from teaching it some things that are going to be very harmful and that some things are stereotypes.
Oh, I could add things, but I think we can move on.
Okay, well, I think we can open it up to the audience at this point for any questions or thoughts. Anybody? Okay. Yeah, I think you had your sheet up sometime back, so.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering what the panel thinks about kind of like the moral panic creep. Is kind of what I feel like it is basically of, people who are more focused on cancel culture or like a social censorship, pushing that like into school systems, for example. I think the group I'm thinking of is Moms for Liberty, I think, and they are very dedicated. This is very dedicated to like sending people from their group to different schools they don't even have children attending, mind you. School districts just to ban books about Black history, queer history, all these different things. So I guess I'm kind of worried about what you all think about the social implications of that and potentially like even the law implications of that. Like, especially when there's this group where it's not really like parents concerned for their own children, and I think you can have concern for strangers' children, but this is a group that is political, that is dedicated to pushing censorship and kind of like the veneer of concerned parents, if that makes sense.
Lauren?
So one thing that really concerns me with regards to that is, especially when we've seen, alongside of that, we've seen certain pro-censorship attitudes on the rise amongst people who would otherwise consider themselves socially liberal about what themes children should and should not be exposed to. And there are psychological studies that have been done that show that when children and teenagers read about themes that are challenging, that are morally complex, that they actually have more empathy in real life than those who don't. So even if a book did contain themes that certain people might find objectionable, even if it wasn't just being used as a tool to censor marginalized people's speech, it still wouldn't necessarily hold water, because reading about a theme in fiction doesn't equate to condoning that theme in real life. And beyond that, as I said earlier, it is still actively being used as a tool to censor the speech of marginalized people. And it's especially disheartening when I see people who are trying to censor certain authors sort of use that as a haha gotcha when that author's book gets censored, because it's like, why are you siding with the people who want to see your rights taken away on this? Because at the end of the day, even if you try to frame yourself as one of the good ones, they're not going to see the people who are holding those bigoted beliefs are not going to see you as one of the good ones. They believe people coming from marginalized communities, queer people, people of color, etc., are all equally less than them in their eyes. And I think that people who are trying to side with them in hopes of being seen in a better light are fighting a losing battle.
So from a legal standpoint, there's two main issues here. First, you have selection independence, and then you have standing to sue. So we'll start with selection independence. So generally libraries have the independence to select and curate, right, their collection as they see fit, and especially public libraries. There's generally like a board of the library, and of course the librarians have like master's degrees in, library studies or biblio studies or whatever it is. These are highly educated people, right? They have a board of and they have their selection criteria. They select and curate the books. This is all they do, and they do it well. All right, so what they're trying to do, and they as in people who are trying to stop this free speech or this free exchange of information at libraries and are trying to select which topics these librarians should be able to show, are basically going to school board members or other people in order to pitch this to them to say, this book is harmful, please bring it up and please try to ban this book. The reason they're doing that is because you also constitutionally need standing to sue. Standing means that you need to be directly harmed or impacted by whatever the rule or regulation is, and you need to be able to show that, and then the court will say, okay, because you are a person who will be harmed by this law, this rule, or this regulation, you now have standing to sue, and you can sue about this in court. But when you're a political organization with no kids in that school district, you don't have any standing to sue because you can't show that you have any harms. So therefore, instead of trying to say, hey, my kids are harmed by this, they take the books to a school board member and say, hey, here's our list of books that we believe are super harmful. Please raise this at the next school board meeting and make a motion to say that, use the procedure to say that these books are harmful and I want to get rid of it, right? And then some places require there to then be a committee or a task force that looks into it, and some places don't, right, per their bylaws, depending on how their school district is organized. So sometimes it can work to take that list to a school board member, and they don't even have to give a reason, but they can motion for it to be banned. And if there's enough other school board members to motion with them or to vote alongside them, then they can just ban the list of books without having standing or being able to show that they're harmed in any way. So that's one way that they've been so far successfully attacking the library selection, by having the school board just say, we don't want these books in our school library. For the public library, slightly different. Sometimes you can have a governor who might be willing to put out an executive order commanding the libraries not to have certain books, or so if you have a county commissioner, sometimes they can have the authority for, depending on how their county is set up and structured, the county commissioner may be able to also ban some books. And so you're looking at people using the law, using these procedural mechanisms in order to do this, because again, they don't really have any direct harms from these books that they can show, because there are none.
Okay, I think, yes, purple.
I have noticed that sometimes people will not use a rational argument for why they believe something cannot, should not, and cannot, and by gum will not in their book be shown or talked about or discussed. And I find this often an emotional reaction as opposed to a logical one. It's because it gives them the personal ick. And to quote Marge Simpson, I don't personally enjoy it, therefore I think no one should be allowed to engage with it. And this just seems to be like a symptom of a larger anti-intellectualism that's been on the rise in America. Because America has, there are other countries out there. I see you guys, I promise I know you're there. I just can't read your stuff, I'm sure it's great. But America at least has, I've heard the phrase America sneezes, the world catches a cold, and that's pretty ethnocentric, but it does seem to have some standing in areas that I can access as an American, where this sort of anti-intellectualism seems to be seeping into other cultures, at least a little bit, and bringing with it the emotional reaction over a reaction to things, and it seems to also be spreading a little bit. Have you seen this, and how do we deal with it an emotional reaction over an intellectual reaction? Because you can't reason away, I don't like it.
So I actually want to bring up a little bit of fandom history here. Something that people who catalog fandom history over the last 15, 20 years have written about. I would particularly recommend Sam Agurime's papers on the subject. is, you had mentioned the pro-ship and anti-ship discourse. That originally came about, one of the first instances where that began was in the fandom for Voltron Legendary Defender. And it specifically rose about when people who were against shipping Shiro and Keith didn't really find much success trying to go to the standard internet flame ship wars with sheathed shippers over it. So they tried to instead find some kind of moral leg to stand on by claiming that the age gap between the two characters was unethical. And it was clear from the previous times that they had tried to denounce sheathed shippers without bringing that moral aspect into it, that, okay, you're probably just making this argument because it's a ship that you don't enjoy personally, but people who were looking for that sort of straw man argument of the age gap is unethical, or in the case of other ships, you know, insert whatever moral claim you're trying to ascribe to it here, sort of latched onto it. And I think that if you look at the history of ship discourse over the next few decades that followed that, you can see where those sort of attempts to paper over disliking a ship for personal reasons with moral arguments that aren't really sound is kind of a through line through a lot of it.
Was it a bigger age gap than Buffy and Angel?
No.
I think it's totally crazy how like one parent who doesn't mind their kid playing Call of Duty for like 6 hours on a Saturday, right, is then angry that their kid has an opportunity to read and enjoy A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry because it was written by a Harlem Renaissance writer. Like, that's wild. You would want your kid to read, right? Whether they're reading, you know, A Raisin in the Sun or, you know, some other awesome book, like, I think it's just absurd to say, I don't want my kid to read this book that is definitely appropriate for a kid at their age to read, you know, because it's in the library. Some censorship is just illogical because it's more so just about hatred, which is illogical, to hate other human beings for reasons such as the color of your skin. It just doesn't have logic behind it to begin with.
Yeah, I think that the emotional argument is a very strong one, and it's very, very difficult to fight, have an argument where one side is having an emotional argument or giving specific emotional examples, and then another side that wants to go through it logically. And if you have two parties who are, or more parties who are discussing things on the same level, and you're both talking about logic and, you know, large scale, you know, research, scientific method, that you can have those types of conversations. But when you're having one side who's using specific examples of emotional arguments or something like that, you really have to use other examples to respond to it, other specific examples. And the only way that you can really get through to having a deeper conversation there is by first acknowledging the harm or the validity of their argument. Whether or not you agree with it entirely, there is a personal truth there that this is something that someone has experienced and they feel that very deeply, and they have this connection to. And so being able to acknowledge that and say, I see where you're coming from at some level, even if it's, you know, there's a lot of variability there, right? Their experience is their experience, but that doesn't invalidate the harm that experience, if they are implementing it and then applying it to other situations, could be having on other people, right? So giving counter examples of, you know, I understand that this particular thing that you have an objection to has caused direct harm to this group of people or could have the potential to cause harm. There is another group of people for whom that would have the opposite effect. So like this person was harmed by this sort of abusive relationship that's portrayed in this media. Another person who maybe has had a similar experience or an opposite experience even, they may benefit from having a space to emotionally process and work through that in a safe, enclosed space. I'm giving specifically fandom examples here, like, you know, if someone has had an abusive relationship and they want to explore that abusive relationship in order to process through it, that trauma, in a fandom space in a way that they are emotionally connecting to through, you know, reading and empathy and experiencing the story, but then they can make it their own by, for example, writing fanfic about it. And they can write about these complex, difficult topics that they've experienced or that they empathize with or that they are concerned for someone else about. And they are having space for them to do that could allow them to learn and process and grow and be in community with other people who've experienced something similar. And so trying to give an example that counterweighs that emotional impact of the one story while giving it validity, right? One of the things that I feel pretty strongly about in a fandom context, but which could have real world implications, obviously in a world with increasing censorship in a sort of legal sense or a more official capacity, is putting tags on things, making sure that people understand what they're getting into, or, you know, so people can self-limit what they are exposed to if they know it will be triggering or if they're not in a space where they can safely read that or watch that. Like, there was a panel earlier this weekend about, you know, does the dog die? If the dog dies, I'm not watching. You know, I need to know what I'm getting into to be able to say, is it going to be safe for me to process and watch this media or engage with this media in some way? So having fandom spaces where people can make those choices is also valuable in and of itself. Setting aside that, you know, if you're tagging everything, it might be easier for people to find the things that they personally disagree with if they're in a position of power and, you know, do something else with them, like ban them. That's a separate sort of conversation, but being able to engage with that content, there is a value to being able to do that in a controlled way.
Finally, I would say, remember, some censorship is just about control. They know it's going to cause harm, and that's exactly what they want to do.
Yeah.
Blue shirt, green asterisk.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, like, how do you deal with people who are, like, rage farming? They're purposely trying to get people to disagree with them. They're saying incendiary things in order to get views or clicks or whatever. How do you deal with not allowing that in your space, but also not going too far and censoring people that you just don't agree with?
That's a good question. It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Don't feed the beast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so don't put energy, you know, into that. You know, instead of like going there and engaging with them, maybe go to a moderator or something like that, and then have it flagged in some way for just like incendiary comments if they allow that. So then people will know if they click on this comment, it's going to be incendiary, and they can choose whether or not they want to view it. Hopefully, if the community has that type of setup.
I was pretty much going to echo what you said on that.
There's a term called sea lioning.
Yes.
So it depends on what you're in a position, like what kind of context this is in. If it's in a Discord server, they may have rules against that. If you're on Blue Sky, there are moderation lists that you can kind of choose to include or exclude. There's always, you know, making group discussions with groups of people who are interested in having those specific types of conversations and not including the people who are trying to be deliberately incendiary. But I think, yeah, just a good general rule of thumb is that you don't engage with them. Let them, if they want to shout and they want to engage with other people who want to shout, that's fine. Like, you can do that in your space, but I'm not interested in that, and so I'm not going to engage with it. I'm going to curate my experience in the way that I can. And for me personally, I try really hard not to have an ego when I am curating my online space, and I hope that other people will feel similarly. In that if they're not vibing with what I'm doing, block me, mute me, unfollow me. Like, that's fine. I don't care. That's okay. I mean, I do care at some level, but it doesn't have to be emotionally charged with that. You're curating your experience. And I'm curating my experience, and I'm engaging with the people that I want to engage with, and not engaging with people who are doing things in bad faith that I disagree with.
Yeah, I have the green, or is that yellow?
It's great.
Okay.
So this is a legal question for representing for Jules. From my understanding, last month the Supreme Court established a right for parents to opt out their children from instruction and exposure to LGBTQ content related in schools. At the same time, a large number of predominantly conservative states, such as Kansas, where I live, have passed laws in the last 3 years restricting internet access to everyone for websites that contain adult content by requiring inputting personally identifying information from a government-issued ID in order to access the website, citing fears of children being exposed to adult content. Those laws were also affirmed as constitutional last month. Given these two trends, I'm afraid of conservative state governments next trying to censor all LGBTQ content online, including LGBTQ video games, visual novels, TTRPGs, /fic, etc., to restrict it to require a government ID in order to either access the website or purchase a game, labeling it as adult content, and using these two recent Supreme Court decisions to justify that. Is that me catastrophizing, or is that a real possibility that could actually happen?
You always have to be aware of the slippery slope, right? So usually it starts with one area where they feel people can come together around, right? And so they're gonna say, we wanna censor, pornography because, men have an issue with pornography, right? Some of the conservative states, right, that are very heavy, like church specific, right? They're about getting rid of pornography and the lust that comes from it, right? And so that's a through line that they can work through to get people to support it. But yes, once you're able to censor and get the court to say you can censor this type of content, then that spreads to all other types of content because again, the equal protection laws that you have to treat similarly situated people the same. But where you push back at that is every time you make a claim that the government has violated your constitutional rights, which this is a claim. So remember we talked about the chilling of free speech. That is we also read over the First Amendment of the Constitution that included your right to assemble with other people. So that the courts have recognized includes your right to assemble in online communities with other people, right? And so we have to look at the restraints on speech that these laws bring. And they will basically come to what's called strict scrutiny in the government, right? So that is where the government, once they're sued, which they have been and they will continue to be for these types of laws, they have to then go before the court, and the government has to argue this particular law is narrowly tailored in order to achieve a specific government interest, right? So they have to say our specific government interest in regulating pornography is this, and then they have to lay it out. And they have to say, and this particular law is narrowly tailored to hit only that specific government interest. If it hits other government interests or other things outside of that, right, then the other side will argue, well, now this law is actually overly broad. It restricts too much speech, not just what they're saying that it's intended to restrict, and therefore it should be unconstitutional, right? And usually when something faces strict scrutiny, it is difficult for the government to surmount that, right? Because they really have to show it is super narrowly tailored in. So that makes it kind of tough. But with that, we also have to look at and remember that we kind of have in our United States of America, two kind of sets of authorities. So we do have the federal Constitution, the Constitution of the United States of America, right? And under that, in the federal system, you then have your statutes that are passed by both houses of Congress, United States Congress. And under that, you then have your precedent, which are basically your body of court rulings. On the state side, you also have a state constitution, right? Then you have the laws that were passed by your state's legislature, and then you have your precedents and your orders that were basically passed by your courts, the rulings of your courts. Now with that, Minnesota,
So
everybody
it's like
here.
kind of,
Oh, sorry. You have a state constitution and a federal constitution. The Minnesota state constitution does offer more constitutional protections than the federal constitution. I believe our constitution does protect gender identity. And so we have more protections here for certain rules or laws than some other states.
I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time, unfortunately. Just if the panelists can please just reintroduce themselves, let us know of any online things you'd like to let us know, or anything else that you're doing for the rest of the day that people can attend. Okay?
Kerry, again, she, her, they, them. I love to talk with people afterwards if you have questions. I encourage people to stay involved in your local communities and activism spaces if you feel so called. Stay engaged, but take care of yourself. And try to appreciate and live into that gray area when it feels like something is too big and too black and white, too polarizing. Try to look for the gray areas, look for the truth, and look for personal stories, and try and understand people on both sides, or multiple sides.
I'm Jules, and it's been such a pleasure to be a guest of honor this year at CONvergence. I've so enjoyed all these different panels that I've been a part of. My last panel will be at 2 o'clock, and it'll be called Where Have You Been? It's basically just all the things that we've been through to be where we are today. So kind of an overcoming panel.
I'm Lauren, Lauren the Corgi on Blue Sky. Once again, just prepare for adult themes if you look that up. One thing I forgot to mention up top was I'm also Lauren the Corgi on Start Playing, which is where all of my work as a professional game master is hosted. I don't have any more panels planned for the con. My previous two were on Friday, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions afterwards because my schedule is relatively free after this, and I will more than likely be back at CONvergence next year.
And I'm Assad. I have a panel on Galaxy Quest at 3:30. And yeah, with podcast, Police Box in the Junkyard, where I and a couple of friends discuss Doctor Who related stuff. And I'd like to thank the panelists for being awesome and amazing and giving a lot of useful insight. And I'd like to thank the audience for turning up. Thank you very much, and have a great last day of CONvergence.